Vinod, so your expertise is on the conflicts.
Yeah, South Asian security, India-US relations, at larger the role of great power influencing the South Asian region.
And what is this role of the United States on South Asian security?
I think South Asia, you look at South Asia, generally US role in South Asia can be probably looked at from two broad perspectives. One is US role as it was conceptualized during the Cold War as part of the ideological divide between the United States and the Soviet Union. So in that context, the type of perceptions that US policymakers had were largely conditioned by the Cold War logistics at that point of time. And hence, when ideologically India and the United States had a number of differences at that point of time. One could also recall, the efforts made by various US presidents, including right since President Truman's time onwards, particularly to cultivate the Indian leadership, and Nehru in particular. That's why Nehru was always also invited to visit the United States in 1949, trying to perhaps win him over. It did not necessarily happen because Nehru was looking at India's interest through the prism of a framework that provided us more space, which broadly took the shape of what we call the non-alignment movement. So India was very conscious of having to preserve and protect its hard-won freedom from the British. So I think that was the framework in which India-US relations also evolved. So I think India was trying to actually play the role of a bridge builder. So if you look at most of the conflicts that started during the Cold War, especially the Korean War, early 50s, India was trying to play the role of a bridge builder. At least India hoped that it could be a bridge builder. It partially succeeded, though not entirely. But I think the plus point was that we had also to take forward our interests at that point of time, when we realized that we would also need friends, to back us up in scenarios which became diplomatically embarrassing for us in the United Nations, for example. And I think and also in terms of our regional conflicts and tussles that we had with countries like the South Asian region, like with Pakistan particularly. So I think we had to also look for friends, not allies. We were looking for friends, and that's how the Soviet Union came into the limelight. So I think if you look at our relations with Soviet Union initially, we did not have the best of relations with the Soviet Union. In fact, even during Stalin's time, Stalin was very skeptical of the nature of the Indian political leadership. In fact, he even used to call them lackeys of the imperialists, because he never thought India was truly independent. That was his perception.
Yeah, exactly. But, especially at that time.
Yeah, especially at that time. So things began to change subsequently. So we realized that on a number of occasions in the United Nations and also at a bilateral level with the United States, we realized that we would have to manage the philosophy of non-alignment on the one hand and the reality of having to, take forward our national and regional interests. So this clearly was reflective of the divide between India and the United States at that point of time, because our national interests, our regional interests, clashed with the regional and global interests of the United States very clearly at that point in time. And in terms of how developments evolved in the South Asian region, especially in terms of our relations with Pakistan, of course with China, of course with China, we had to sort of also look for allies, and that's where Soviet Union came into perspective, because we also had to back our diplomatic stand on, say, Goa, for example, where the Portuguese were still holding on to Goa at that point in time. And we were criticized by the Americans at that point in time. John Foster Dulles, who was then Secretary of State, actually criticized India. Whereas the Soviet foreign minister, I guess at that time, Alexei Kosygin probably, was one and also Khrushchev and Bulganin, both of them visited India in mid-1950s, and they very strongly backed up India on an issue of this kind. I'm just giving you one example. Okay, so for a variety of reasons, in the post-Stalin phase, things began to change in our relationship with the Soviet Union. Like even when Nehru was Prime Minister, because of the state of India-Soviet relations, he even sent his sister Vijayalakshmi Pandit as ambassador to Moscow, hoping to build bridges. But it did not necessarily happen. So it was only in the post-Stalin phase that actually relations began to improve.
Professor, sorry to interfere, but you mentioned Nehru.
Yes.
And for us, there in Central Asia, when we study South Asia, it is very interesting, like the approach of the United States in terms of security towards Pakistan. What is your view on that?
Yeah, I think it all started in 1953. President Eisenhower was there, and when they decided to enter into a mutual defense assistance pact with Pakistan in 1953. So that was when Nehru also actually made the statement that by doing so, the United States was bringing the Cold War to South Asia, to our borders actually. So that was the immediate reaction of Prime Minister Nehru. And incidentally, perhaps you also know that at that point of time, the Americans also offered weapons and weapon systems to India, almost simultaneously, which Indian government did not accept because on a principle note that if you critique the Americans for having entered into this MDAP with Pakistan, how can we accept arms from them? So on that principle stand, we did not accept. Okay, whether right or not is a different thing, but we did not accept. Okay, so I think since then there has been a Cold War in our bilateral relations with the United States consistently, especially on this issue, because over time, we were always telling the Americans that and as Krishna Menon, who was a very close advisor to Nehru, for many years, okay, he used to make the statement that guns do not necessarily point in one direction. When the Americans were always sort of assuring us that these weapons being provided to Pakistan will not be used against us. But this did not happen in 1965, as you know, when the war started between India and Pakistan. And we were able to prove to the Americans that it was American weapons and weapon systems that were being used against us during the war. And in terms of the weapons that and systems that, that came into our custody as a result of the war.
And how these Soviet-Russian weapons came to India?
That came subsequently. After the war, after 1965, okay, it was Y.B. Chavan who was, if I remember, probably the defense minister. Okay, I stand corrected if my memory fails me. He visited the United States. This was even before the 1965 war, actually. I think it was after the 1962 war with China. We really learned our bitter lessons that we need to, because we were not indigenous. A power that was indigenously able to produce defense equipment at that point of time. Okay, so we had to depend on either the United States or the Soviet Union. I mean, we hardly looked towards Europe at that point of time, unlike now, when we increasingly look towards Western Europe to provide us weapons and weapon systems also as part of this, need to diversify at this point. So Y.B. Chavan actually visited United States, okay. And at that point of time also, Nehru was alive, okay. Kennedy was, the American government was approached for weapons and assistance to India because of the Chinese invasion. And Kennedy is also supposed to have made the statement, which is probably recorded by Arthur Schlesinger, I think, who was one of the biographers of John F. Kennedy, where it's recorded by the former U.S. ambassador to India, who also became is trying to recall his name, whose memoirs are available, in which he says that Kennedy's immediate retort was, after the request was made, that can't you protect yourself even for a week? Okay, so I think that was a major shake-up for us, obviously, a big disappointment for Nehru, and also a realist having to look at things more pragmatically. Began to look at things more pragmatically, and that is when we could not strike a deal with the Americans in terms of long-term weapon supplies to India after the 62 war, and then he went to Soviet Union. That is how that relationship was established with the Soviets, which over time got legitimized, okay, and perhaps reached its pinnacle in 1971 when Mrs. Indira Gandhi was there as Prime Minister as part of an agreement signed with the Soviet Union, which we call the Indo-Soviet Treaty of Peace, Friendship and Cooperation 1971. Okay, so since then, as you know, we are almost, even today, probably about 65% dependent on Russian weapons and weapon systems, which at one point of time was almost 75%.
Yeah, but of course, the reason is like the European, American weapons, they come just as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely.
And Russian one, you just can.
Yeah. So there were possibilities of co-production also in India, as you know. So of course the major shock for us was again after the end of the Cold War when the Soviet Union disintegrated, and then we realized that we would have to diversify. You know, today we have diversified in a manner where we are also getting weapons and weapons from Western European countries, the French, you know, the British, the Swedish, Bofors guns, the Israelis. Okay, so we have diversified in a variety of ways, including Americans, of course, right since 1995, I think, after the Kitch-Leiter proposals were agreed to between India and the United States, we have gone in for also importing weapons and weapon systems. But there's a difference, as you rightly said. Okay, so we are still negotiating with the Americans for the possibility of co-production, which, you know, they have their own reasons probably not to.
This is like similar to how we diversified our oil sector.
Okay.
You know, the Europeans are there, the United States is there, Russia is there, China is there, and then we desperately wanted India to come at the first 20 years of our sovereignty.